Good morning. It's a beautiful day in this neighborhood. It's a little warm, but a beautiful day. So, I am the director of the Fred Rogers Center, and that means I get to live and actually work in what we call the original Mr. Rogers neighborhood. It's a very small town of Latrobe, Pennsylvania, which is where Fred was born and raised. And after he retired from television, Fred helped to establish the Fred Rogers Center. I'm just curious, for how many of you had Mr. Rogers' neighborhood being a part of your growing up or your children's growing up and grandchildren maybe? Thank you. I feel right at home now. So let me just start with a neighborhood greeting that so many of you may be quite familiar with as you were growing up.
It's a beautiful day in this neighborhood, a beautiful day for a neighbor. Would you be mine? Could you be mine? It's a neighborly day in this beauty wood, a neighborly day for a beauty. Would you be mine? Could you be mine? I have always wanted to have a neighbor just like you. I've always wanted to live in a neighborhood with you. So let's make the most of this beautiful day. Since we're together, we might as well say, would you be mine? Could you be mine? Won't you be my neighbor? Won't you please? Won't you please? Please won't you be my neighbor? Won't you please? Won't you please? Please won't you be my neighbor?
Thank you. And as many of you know, that Mr. Rogers' neighborhood started the national broadcast in 1968, almost exactly 50 years ago. Actually, at this time, 50 years ago, Fred and his colleagues were actually filming the first season of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. By the time he retired, it was the longest running children's television program in the United States. Right now, the longest running program is Sesame Street, and tomorrow you'll hear from Dr. Bentoncourt from Sesame Workshop. And as you notice kind of in the intro, there's something constant or consistent about what Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood is. Even as the world have changed, clearly the TV technology have changed, but there's something unchanging about the way that he went about doing programming for children and families. And it's a reflection of the standard by which he held his own work, not just the television program, but all of his work, his letters to the viewers, his speeches. He held it to the standard that he calls it deep and simple is far more essential than shallow and complex. Profundo y sencillo es mucho más esencial que superficial y complicado. I actually don't speak Spanish, so the Spanish professor at the college had to help me with that. But one of the things that Fred was so interested in, whether he met with you one-on-one or whether he was giving a speech, is that he was interested to know, what do you think is deep and simple in your work? What is the deep and simple that inspired you and called you to serve children and families in the first place, and then to keep going when the going gets tough? And ultimately, what is deep and simple about you? For me, I started my work as a developmental psychologist, but it took a very long time for me to begin to understand the deep and simple in the work of children's development. And it came from quite an unusual place. So almost a decade ago, I had the opportunity to go work in a very small village on the east coast of China. And it's a very ordinary kind of a village with just about 800 families. The reason we went there was because there was something unusual about the village. There were 200 orphans with moderate to severe disabilities who had been placed in this village as foster children. So the farmers became foster families for these children. And part of our job at the time was to simply go into the village and document what everyday life was like for the children and families there. And the way we would do it then as well as now is to just kind of be a fly on the wall and just observe and capture on film what people were doing kind of day in and day out in the most ordinary, mundane moments. And I just wanted to share with you just a very small slice of what life is like in this village. Just a 30-second slice of the preschool in the village that the farmers have kind of built and started and staffed just for these children, for these 200 children. So this little clip is just going to be about 30 seconds long. Okay.
跪下来了。
So I think I can safely assume that the vast majority of you do not speak Chinese, right? And you don't understand what they're saying. But I don't think that matters, right? So from where I stand, I can see that long before you laughed, you smiled, right? There's something that instinctively gives you a feel of what that place is like. And it's a good feeling. Right? It's a good feeling that this is a kind of a place that could actually be good for children. And what was remarkable about that village is that almost everywhere we went, whether it is in the preschool or whether it's in the rehab room for children with cerebral palsy, or whether it's on the streets, and they only have 2 streets in the village, or whether it's on the playground or in the foster homes, everywhere we went, there was this good feeling about the place. Later on, one of our featured speakers, Mr. Schmitz, is going to talk about this idea that everyone leads and the community can come together to create impact. I didn't understand all of that then, but that, in my memory, is what that village was like. And it reminded me of something that I had read not too long before my visit. It was a paper called Young Children Developing an Environment of Relationships. And it was the inaugural working paper for the Center on the Developing Child at Harvard, which many of you probably know of their work advocating for early childhood over the last decade. And the theme of the paper was simply that relationships are the active ingredients of the environment's influence on healthy human development. I remember in 2004, I think, when I was reading the paper, I just thought, oh, of course, relationships are important. Nobody's going to argue against that, and it is. But I think it was only after I had a chance to visit places like the village that it started to dawn on me that the word active ingredient meant something even more than just saying it's important. And the realization came to me, I was a young parent at the time, and one of the jobs I have was to supervise my girls brushing their teeth. And it's a really boring thing, right? If you've done it, because they can't even talk to you. So I tried to read in the bathroom whatever I can read, and when I ran out of reading, I started to read the labels behind all the products that we have in the bathroom. And in the back of the toothpaste, and you can try this when you go home, but in the back of the toothpaste, it has labels that look like this, and there's going to be a box that says active ingredient, which for toothpaste is sodium fluoride. And then there's going to be a very long list of inactive ingredients, which includes baking soda, gum, flavoring, color, and so on. And I just remembered that a question came to my mind at the time, and I didn't have the answer at the time, but I was wondering, in all of the work that have to do with children, whether it's in early childhood or K through 12 or social work or adoption and foster care, if we were to label the ingredients of our work, what is it that we would put under the box active ingredient? And what are all the things we did list under the inactive ingredients? And the way it works, I think, for the toothpaste is that imagine if you had 2 tubes of toothpaste, right? One of them have everything, including sodium fluoride, and the other has everything but sodium fluoride. Superficially, on the surface, they all look the same, they taste the same, right? But one of them protects you against cavity and the other doesn't. And the relationship between inactive ingredients and the active ingredient is that the inactive ingredient matters if and only if the active ingredient is already there. So take the example of bubblegum flavor. We know it doesn't do anything for your teeth, right? But what the bubblegum flavor does is that it helps children, my girls anyway, to hold the toothpaste in their mouth for 2 minutes. And if they can do that, then the sodium fluoride has a chance to work. So the reason we have bubblegum flavor is to support the active ingredient. You take the fluoride out, the bubblegum flavor does nothing. What if we think about that in the context of our work with children and families? What if, like the Harvard paper, that the human relationships, positive human relationships, are the active ingredient, or the sodium fluoride of our work, that everything else, our curriculums, our facilities, our binders, policies, credentials, certificates, all of that are the inactive ingredients. That is not to say that the inactive ingredients are unimportant. It's just that all of the inactive ingredients can work if and only if the active ingredient is there. And that all of our work comes down to one simple question, which is that what is it that we're doing to help support and strengthen the human relationship? And in the context of that small village, that finally began to make sense to me. When I thought of the village and I thought of all the things that they do not have: material wealth, material resources, professional resources. In the video that you saw, right, here's this one preschool teacher working with 3 children with varying levels of disabilities. But she doesn't even have a high school education. Her qualification was as a foster mother. And she had been with those 3 children for the last 2 years, and she just knows them. And they had very little. I don't know if you can see on video or not, but what they had was this pen and a torn piece of tissue paper that was stuck in the cap of the pen. Right? They make up what they don't have. And I thought that if I had gone into the village with all the binders that I have on my bookshelf, and many of you probably have those, that's why you laugh, because it's like if you go back to your office, it's behind your head, right? And if I had raided the village using these binders, I don't think they would come out as well. There are a lot of boxes I wouldn't be able to check off. It's not that these binders are unimportant, but these binders document the many, many elements, active and inactive, that is in that system. But what you were able to see in those 30 seconds, even without being able to understand Chinese, right, is you saw the one thing that really mattered in the village. And that's what I would call that the at least one principle coming out of all of developmental science. So the most recent working paper that the Center on Developing Child published was on the topic of resilience. Resilience simply meant a person's capacity to bounce back even after they have experienced adversity in life. And the conclusion is that in decades of research about resilience, the single most common finding is that children who end up doing well have had at least one stable and committed relationship with a supportive parent, caregiver, or other adult. At least one. And that's what they had in the village. For everything they don't have, they had this one thing that mattered, that every child, no matter where they went, had at least one, and hopefully many more. And these are children who have been abandoned near birth because of the social prejudices and the value systems regarding their disability. But even for children like that, they can learn, they can grow in a place with limited resources, but has the one active ingredient that mattered. But what are these relationships made of? If we had followed that village from the very beginning and watched them day in and day out, what is it that builds that relationship? The way Mr. Rogers often understands it and articulates it is that he believed in the power of small things. Like Mother Teresa would say, doing small things with great love. Fred would say, the longer I live, the more convinced I am that the important moments of life rarely happen center stage. What truly nourishes our hearts and changes our being are most often far from the spotlight. I wanted to share with you something recently that really kind of inspired me and triggered me to think about the power of these small things, these small, ordinary gestures, far away from the spotlight. Last fall, we had the opportunity to work, doing very similar work in the School for the Deaf in upstate New York. And we were just there for 2 days to film and to use the film to help the staff, the teachers in the School of Deaf, to reflect on their own work. And so this was just one of those moments that we captured. What you see here is that you have a little boy, 2 years old. He's deaf, he's completely deaf, and he was also profoundly autistic. So up until this time, he hasn't been able to communicate with his family. So his parents brought him to the deaf school in the hopes that the deaf school could help him to find a way to communicate. So I'm just going to run the clip, and you're going to hear the sounds a little bit, but then what I'll do is I'm actually going to turn the sound off, right? Because I think as far as that little boy, that's what it would have sounded like. What the teacher here have discovered over the last few months is that even though Gavin, the little boy, couldn't communicate, Gavin had an interest in seeing bubbles. So the teacher was doing bubbles with Gavin, and the teacher was trying to sign bubbles or blow or bubbles with Gavin. And just keep your eyes, don't blink. I know it's 2 minutes long, but just keep your eyes on that interaction and on Gavin.
Well, that's very encouraging.
Oh, sorry. It's okay.
Huh? We'll get one up top. So, ready?
Get one up top, honey.
Oh, we got it on our shirt.
I'm sorry. It's washable.
I know.
She's done with that color. These are wet ones. Again.
Oh, so.
Turn it again. It doesn't help that I have to wear these gloves,
Yeah.
so I apologize. I had to injure my hand the day before. You know what? I can just... What do you want? Bubbles? Ready for yellow? What do you want? Okay, Sophie, ready? Ready? Just straighten it out for me. Oh, I got it.
The next day in the deaf school, when we showed this particular clip along with many others, there was a gasp in the teachers of the deaf school, half of whom are deaf themselves. There was a gasp in the room, just a little bit like what you just had now, because most of the teachers know Gavin, and everybody knows that Gavin doesn't sign. And the teacher herself, she started to cry, because I think in that moment she was just so with him that it took a day for her to realize the importance of that particular moment. But one of the things that Mr. Rogers always believed from his favorite childhood book, The Little Prince, is that what is essential is invisible to the eye. What makes that moment so important are really the hundreds of moments that have to come before that moment. Can you imagine how many moments have happened in the days and weeks and months before that moment that build up to it? That the patience all of you had in watching silently for 2 minutes. Imagine the kind of patience that teacher had for the month before that to do what she thought was right now, without being able to see the impact and the outcome. And to be able to invest in every moment until a moment like that comes. And she just went on, even when that moment comes, that it took the next day seeing herself on film for her to be moved by what she had done. And moments like that, the ones that are seen as well as the many that are unseen, are what relationships are made of. That Fred would say that human relationships are primary in all of living. When the gusty winds blow and shake our lives, if we know that people care about us, we may bend with the wind, but we won't break. All of us wish to do everything we can for children and families, but few of us have the power to stop the winds from blowing. But what we do have the power to do is the idea that we can make the difference between breaking and bending. Through our relationships and building our relationships in the smallest, most mundane moments. How does early childhood as a field, how does early childhood come together to promote, to honor, to support this idea of providing a web of relationships around even the most vulnerable children? I wanted to share with you a story that really touched me and almost reshaped my understanding of early childhood just since last fall. And the story came from a pioneer in our field named Louise Derman-Sparks. For those of you who might have heard her name or read her book, you may know her as an advocate and a national trainer when it comes to curriculums in early childhood that's anti-bias and anti-racism. But before her conviction led her to become an advocate in that arena, Louise Derman-Sparks, inspired by the civil rights movement of the 1960s, became a teacher fresh out of graduate school in a program that some of you may have heard. It was a program called Perry Preschool in Ypsilanti, Michigan. The reason Perry Preschool is so important is that it's the first of the what we call big three in the research on early childhood that started in the 60s and going onward. Those are the studies that track children who attended preschool all the way through life, through their 20s, 30s, all the way to 40s, to document the impact that high-quality early experiences had on the children. And Perry Preschool was the first of the three. And often we talked, especially in the last few years, about return on investment for early childhood. Well, Perry Preschool had the highest return on investment, estimated somewhere around $13 to $18 for every dollar invested in that effort. Now, what is sensational and in the spotlight is the $13 in return. But the important story is what happened in 1962 to 1967 in Perry Preschool. And that is a story that, given limited time, I cannot do it justice, but I encourage all of you to just Google and look it up. Louise Derman-Sparks and Evelyn Moore, the two of the teachers of the Perry Preschool, they told their story practically for the first time just last fall, nearly 50 years after the conclusion of Perry Preschool. And it was featured in Young Children, the Legacy sections. It's a two-part story. But what the story gets at is the really important question that sometimes we forget to ask, which is, how did we make that investment in the first place? In particular, how did the teacher invest their energy and their time? Prior to understanding Louise's story, my understanding of Perry Preschool, as well as any of the other early childhood studies, the big threes, are fairly rudimentary and, in hindsight, quite simplistic. I thought that they must have this great curriculum, right? High-quality early childhood curriculum. They had highly qualified teachers who were able to implement and execute the curriculum, and the children came into the preschool and were able to go out ready for school, and then they were ready for life. It's a story that's probably not that foreign to many of you, right? It's the standard story. But in the recollections of Louise Derman-Sparks, and she also explained to me on the phone, the real story to me is so much more interesting than the cliched kind of surface of what early childhood is about. That Louise went to that job out of graduate school, out of a sense of social justice, that she wanted to prove that even in the segregated cities in the North, that it is possible for young black children to learn and grow just like everybody else. And Perry Preschool started off as an extension of the special education department of the public school. And the children they served were children from the segregated public housing projects. 100% of the children were black, and they were selected because at the time they entered Perry Preschool, their IQ fell below the line for mental retardation. And so the way the program ran was that every morning during the weekday for a year, the children would come to school. And by the way, they didn't have state-of-the-art facility. They had an old gym that was converted to be the preschool that was roughly subdivided into 4 little areas for about 24, 25 children. Every morning the children would come, and the teachers would just listen and observe the children play. They would find out what kind of things the children are interested in, and they would try to carefully build activities and ideas on top of what they're interested in and guide them to go further and further. And then, after lunchtime, all the children go home. It was a half-day program. So guess what happens in the afternoon? From Monday through Thursday, the teachers went into the public housing projects and went and visited the homes of each of their children. So for every child in Perry Preschool, their family received a visit from the teacher every week for an hour and a half. And what happened on these home visits? The intent of the program was for the teachers to go in and, quote unquote, correct the parenting deficits. But from the very beginning, the teachers realized, no, we can't do that. We are there to build trust and to build a partnership. And so what the teacher ended up doing is to share with the parents their own excitement over the learning and growing of the children. Because there's a lot they can tell about what the children were doing at school. The teachers also learned to recognize and affirm and help the parents to see all the things that the parents are doing right. And the teachers supported, empowered parents to become advocates for their own children. Not just the children in the preschool, but their older children that was in the school system. That these parents living in segregated public housing projects are very intimidated about how to advocate for their children, and the teachers, being professionals in the school, help them to do that. And between the teachers and parents, they built an enduring relationship. Now, none of these things came easily to any of the teachers, no matter what degrees they had. To work with children who had been labeled as below the mental retardation line on the IQ, to visit homes, the kind of homes that they've never stepped foot in, for which they have never been trained. So how does this group of 4 teachers, there were just 4 of them, how does this group of 4 teachers figure out how to do all this and learn and build the bridge even as they walked on it? Well, you notice this pie is missing a slice, and it's Friday afternoon. There were no children, there were no parents on Friday afternoons in Perry Preschool. Instead, Friday afternoon is blocked for the teachers to work with one another. They had a chance to talk, they have a chance to reflect, to discuss everything that happened in the classroom, in the homes, in the community that week, and they worked together to think about what would happen the following week. It's a sense of a community of practice, a community of professionals who had a sense of identity, mission, who were given the autonomy, and who had a community of their own, even if there were just 4 of them. So if we were to distill that rich story, right, into a simplified model or recipe for at least how Perry Preschool went about doing their work in the very difficult time and difficult circumstances of the late 1960s, it would look something like this. That the teachers invested about 50% of their time interacting with the children. Listening, watching, observing, planning, pushing, nudging, encouraging. But the teachers also understand that as good as the teachers are, as good as the learning environment is, the preschool is just 1 year. Some other programs may be 2 years. But what the children need are interactions like that ongoingly, long after the preschool days were over. And one of the places these interactions are going to come from are the parents. Early childhood educators are with children for just that brief period of early childhood, but the parents will be there for a very long time. So what the teachers did was they invested 40% of their time to empower, to advocate, to partner, to build trust with the parents. And that's the kind of early version of the 2-generation model of how early childhood could work. Another one of our featured speaker, Dr. Briggs, will have a chance to talk about kind of what 2-generation models can look like today. And in order to do all of that, the teachers needed each other as well. That it wasn't just hindsight. It wasn't for the sake of accumulating credits and hours. It was at the very core of their professional identity that the teachers blocked out the remaining 10% of their time to be with one another, to grow as a team of professionals. And that to me was an absolutely remarkable story about the legacy that early childhood field inherit from the 1960s, from the start of the modern early childhood movement. And the story reminded me of the words of St. Francis of Assisi, who talked about, he who works with his hands is a laborer. He who works with his hands and his head is a craftsman. He who works with his hands and his head and his heart is an artist. Many of our colleagues on the front lines serving children and families are paid as if they are laborers. We, as a field, are struggling to gain respect and fair compensation for our work as craftsmen by defining competencies and elevating credentials. Yet, like Fred Rogers, like Louise Derman-Sparks and her colleagues in Perry Preschool, we need to remind ourselves that from the very start of our profession, we are artists in our heart of hearts. And today, we're gathered here in this conference because we're all members of the profession serving early childhood children, families, and communities. And that means all of us are coming together because we serve children directly, because we serve families directly, because we serve in organizing our communities. And there are many of us who help to build and support the kind of systems that would empower all the helpers. Our degrees and titles are different, but we are gathered today, and what unites us all, what connects us all, is the root meaning of what it means to say that we are of a profession. Long before the word profession is identified by degrees and certificates, it is defined in the phrase a profession of faith. It meant to declare openly, to say that you are, that you do, that you feel something when other people doubt what you say. To be of a profession is to believe in something. And for the work of Fred Rogers, that belief translates down to understanding that one of the most important things we can do in our profession is to be a helpful appreciator. And the way Fred described it is this, that the greatest thing we can do is to find what is healthy and laudable about somebody else and reflect that to them. I really think that's the greatest weapon against any kind of bigotry and racism. It's a large assignment to be able to help people look deep within themselves and find what is wonderful there. Because at the core of everyone is someone wonderful. And that is certainly true of the message of every episode of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. It certainly rings true in every room in that small village in China. It is certainly true for the teachers and staff at the School for the Deaf, that the way they saw every child. And it is true in Perry Preschool, the way the teachers saw the children, the way the teachers saw the parents, and the way the teachers saw each other. At the end of every episode of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, Fred would look into the camera, make imaginary eye contact with the one person on the other side of the television who's watching, and he would say, "You've made this day a special day by just your being you. There's no person in the whole world like you, and I like you just the way you are." Now, sometimes people wonder, why would you spend 3 decades and 895 episodes to just convey that one message. At the end of Fred's life and work in 2002, Fred had a chance to explain why we did that. He gave what was to be his last commencement address in life at Dartmouth College, where he went as an undergraduate studying music. And here Fred is not just speaking to children, but speaking to all the children who have grown up with the neighborhood. And I just wanted to share the final few minutes of Fred's commencement speech, where I think he provided the definitive answer as to why Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood came to be.
It's not the honors and the prizes and the fancy outsides of life which ultimately nourish our souls. It's the knowing that we can be trusted, that we never have to fear the truth, that the bedrock of our lives from which we make our choices is very good stuff. There's a neighborhood song that is meant for the child in each of us. And I'd like to give you the words of that song right now. It's you I like. It's not the things you wear. It's not the way you do your hair, but it's you I like. The way you are right now, the way down deep inside you. Not the things that hide you, not your caps and gowns, they're just beside you. But it's you I like, every part of you. Your skin, your eyes, your feelings, whether old or new. I hope that you remember, even when you're feeling blue, that it's you I like, it's you yourself, it's you. It's you I like. And what that ultimately means, of course, is that you don't ever have to do anything sensational for people to love you. When I say it's you I like, I'm talking about that part of you that knows that life is far more than anything you can ever see or hear or touch. That deep part of you that allows you to stand for those things without which humankind cannot survive. Love that conquers hate, peace that rises triumphant over war, and justice that proves more powerful than greed. So in all that you do, in all of your life, I wish you the strength and the grace to make those choices which will allow you and your neighbor to become the best of whoever you are. Congratulations to you all.
Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood was more than just a television program. And the work of early childhood is more than just about little children. For Fred, the reason we invest in early childhood work is not just about getting ready for school or the science of brain development, which in the 1960s weren't there yet, or because there's going to be a financial return on investment to society. While all of these may be important, Fred believed that the work of early childhood will ultimately cherish and nourish the deepest part of who we are as children and as grown-ups. And that is the greatest gift that we can give our world: love that conquers hate, peace that rises triumphant over war, and justice that proves more powerful than greed. And that is Fred's answer to what is deep and simple about the work of early childhood. And like the Perry Preschool, like all the pioneers that have gone before us in early childhood, they leave it to us to find and to live out our own answers to the question, what is deep and simple about your work? So on behalf of all of us from the original Mr. Rogers Neighborhood, I want to thank you for making this day a beautiful day in your neighborhood. Muchísimas gracias por hacer este día un hermoso día en su vecindad. Thank you.